I moved to Chicago in the fall of 2021 after accepting a new job with a healthcare company downtown. Since I was living alone and trying to save money, I rented a small apartment in an older brick building on the north side. The building wasn't fancy, but it was quiet. Most of the tenants had lived there for years. The hallways were narrow, the floors creaked constantly, and the heating pipes made strange noises at night. Still, it felt safe enough. Directly across from my apartment was Unit 3B. The door always remained closed. There was no welcome mat, no decorations, and no signs anyone lived there. A few days after moving in, I asked the landlord about it. "Nobody's there," he told me. "It's been empty for months." I didn't think much about it. Then, about 2 weeks later, I noticed something odd. I came home around midnight after helping a friend move into her new apartment. As I walked down the hallway toward my door, I saw a thin strip of light glowing beneath the door of Unit 3B. I stopped for a second. The apartment was supposed to be vacant. Maybe maintenance workers were inside, I thought. The next morning, the light was gone. A few nights later, I saw it again. This time it was nearly 2 a.m. again. The light disappeared by morning. The pattern continued for several weeks. Always late at night, always gone before sunrise. Whenever I mentioned it to neighbors, nobody seemed concerned. Probably the landlord checking on things, one woman suggested. But something didn't feel right. One evening, while carrying a bag of trash downstairs, I passed the vacant apartment. As I walked by, I heard humming. It was faint, a woman's voice, soft and slow. I froze. The sound lasted only a few seconds before stopping, completely. I stood there staring at the door. Nothing happened. The hallway became silent. The next morning, I called the building manager. He sounded confused. "No one's supposed to be in there." "I heard someone," I insisted. "Maybe it came from another apartment." "It came from inside 3B. The manager promised to check." Later that day, he called back. "The apartment is locked. Nobody's inside." His answer should have reassured me. Instead, it made me more nervous. Over the next month, small things began happening. Nothing major, just enough to make me uncomfortable. My doormat would be slightly crooked. When I came home, packages left outside my door would be moved a few inches. One afternoon, I left a grocery bag outside while bringing in other items. When I returned, less than 2 minutes later, the bag had been repositioned against the wall. There was nobody in the hallway. At first, I blamed my imagination. Then, I started paying closer attention. One night, I came home around 11 p.m. The hallway was dark. No light. Beneath the vacant apartment, I unlocked my door and stepped inside. Few minutes later, I remembered I'd left my phone charger in the car. I went back into the hallway. A strip of light now glowed beneath Unit 3B. I stared at it 5 minutes earlier. There had been nothing. For the first time, a terrible thought crossed my mind. What if someone inside was watching me? After that, I became obsessed with noticing patterns. Whenever I arrived home, the light would appear shortly afterward, not every time, but often enough to frighten me. It felt as if someone knew exactly when I entered the building. One Friday night, I decided to test my theory. Instead of going straight home after work, I sat in my car across the street for almost an hour. The hallway lights were visible through a window near the stairwell. Nothing happened. Finally, I entered the building. Within 10 minutes, light appeared beneath the door of Unit 3B. I remember feeling sick to my stomach. Someone was definitely in there. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. Around 1 a.m., I stepped into the hallway. The light was visible again. The humming had returned, quiet, almost soothing. Slowly, I approached the door. The sound continued. I leaned closer, then I pressed my ear against the wood. The humming stopped. Instantly, my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. Silence. Complete silence. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Footsteps approaching from inside. One step, another, coming, directly toward the door. I backed away immediately and ran into my apartment. For the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. The next morning I called the landlord and demanded he investigate. To my surprise, he agreed. That afternoon he arrived with the building manager. I stood in the hallway while they unlocked the door. The apartment was dark. The smell hit us first. Stale air mixed with old food. The landlord stepped inside and immediately stopped. Oh my God, the apartment wasn't empty. Not exactly. There were blankets spread across the living room floor. Food wrappers, empty water, bottles, batteries, flashlights, a portable radio. Someone had clearly been living there. Then the manager pointed toward the front door. Folding chair sat directly beside the peephole, positioned perfectly to look into the hallway, specifically toward my apartment. I felt my blood run cold. Whoever had been staying there had been watching me. The police arrived shortly afterward. While officers searched the apartment, they discovered something else. A small notebook hidden beneath the chair. Most of the pages were blank, but several entries described activities inside the building. Residents. Leaving for work, returning home, taking out trash, receiving packages. One page mentioned me, not by name, just my apartment number, alongside notes about what time I usually arrived home. The person responsible was gone. No fingerprints were useful. No identification was found. No neighbors remembered seeing anyone enter or leave. It was as if the occupant had vanished the moment they realized. The apartment would be inspected. A month later, I moved out. I never learned who had been living across from me, but sometimes I think about that folding chair beside the peephole. Think about the humming, the footsteps, the notes, and the terrifying realization that for weeks, maybe months, a stranger had been quietly observing my daily life from just a few feet away. Even now, years later, whenever I walk down a quiet apartment hallway and see a vacant unit, I catch myself looking under the door for light. Because once you've discovered that an empty apartment wasn't really empty at all, you never quite trust closed doors the same way again. In the winter of 2019, I was working as a graphic designer for a small marketing company in downtown Chicago. Most of my projects involved clients in different time zones, so late nights were normal for me. By the time I finished work, grabbed a quick meal and headed home, it was often after midnight. For nearly 2 years, my routine rarely changed. I would leave the office, walk a few blocks to the Blue Line station, catch the same train and ride it toward my apartment on the northwest side of the city. Late-night trains usually attracted the same kinds of people: night shift workers, tired students, airport travelers, and occasionally someone who looked like they hadn't slept in days. Most people kept to themselves. That was why I didn't pay much attention to the man the first time I saw him. He boarded at the same downtown station as me. He looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s. Average height, dark winter coat, gray knit cap. Nothing unusual. What stood out was that he never sat down. Even though the train was nearly empty, he remained standing near the connecting door between cars. For the entire ride, he stared at the route map above the windows. I assumed he was unfamiliar with the transit system. Maybe he was a visitor. Maybe he was drunk. I forgot about him before I even reached home. A few nights later, I saw him again. Same coat, same hat, same train car, same position near the connecting door. Again, he spent the entire ride staring at the route map. I noticed him a third time the following week, then a fourth, then a fifth. That's when it started bothering me. Not because he was doing anything threatening, but because everything about his behavior seemed strangely identical every time. He boarded at the same station, entered the same car, stood in the same place, never checked a phone, never spoke to anyone, never looked out the window, just stared at the map, night after night. One Friday, my friend Lucas invited me to meet him at a bar near Logan Square. Since it was along the train route, I got off several stops earlier than usual. As I stepped onto the platform, I noticed movement behind me. The man had exited too. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Maybe he simply needed the same stop. I kept walking. The station was mostly empty. When I reached the stairs, I glanced back. The man was still there, about 50 feet behind me, walking at the exact same pace. I told myself not to panic. People often traveled in the same direction. Still, something felt wrong. At the street entrance, I suddenly stopped and turned around. The man froze. For a second, we looked directly at each other. Then he stepped toward a transit information board and pretended to study it. I remember standing there, confused. The behavior seemed so unnatural, almost rehearsed. When I reached the bar, I told Lucas about it. He laughed. "Dude, maybe you're becoming the creepy one." I laughed too, but the feeling stayed with me. Over the next month, I started paying closer attention. And the more I paid attention, the stranger things became. Sometimes I left work earlier. The man appeared. Sometimes I left much later. The man appeared. I changed train cars. He somehow ended up in the same one. Not immediately. Sometimes he boarded farther down the platform. But eventually he would be there, standing, watching the route map. One night I intentionally boarded the very last car. For the first 10 minutes, I thought I had finally lost him. Then at the next station, the connecting door opened. The man entered and took his usual position. I felt my chest tighten. That wasn't a coincidence anymore. Someone was paying attention to me. The question was why. I considered reporting him to transit police. But what would I say? A man was standing on a train? A man happened to ride the same route? There was no actual crime. No direct threat, nothing concrete. Yet every instinct told me something wasn't right. Then things got worse. One snowy evening, I stopped at a convenience store near my apartment. As I exited, I noticed a figure across the street. The same coat. The same gray hat. Standing beneath a streetlight, watching. I immediately crossed the street. The figure turned and disappeared between two buildings. By the time I reached the corner, he was gone. That night I barely slept. The next morning I left for work through a different exit. For the first time in months I drove instead of taking the train. For several days I altered everything. Different schedules, different stations, different routes. Yet somehow eventually I would see him again, always on the blue line, always standing, always staring at the map. Then came the night that still bothers me years later. I decided I was done wondering. I needed answers. Instead of getting off near my apartment, I stayed on the train. Past my stop. Past several others. All the way to the final station. By then, only 3 passengers remained in the car. An elderly woman, a young man wearing headphones, and me. The stranger was still standing near the connecting door. When the train finally reached the end of the line, everyone exited. The platform was nearly deserted. Cold wind swept through the station. I walked slowly toward the exit. Behind me, I heard footsteps. The stranger had finally moved. For the first time in months, he was approaching me. My heart pounded. Every scenario I had imagined suddenly felt possible. Robbery, assault, something worse. The footsteps stopped beside me. I turned. The man smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not an angry one. Just a calm smile that somehow felt more disturbing than either. Then he spoke. His voice was soft, almost conversational. "Why did you stop going home the usual way?" For a moment I couldn't process what he had said. Of all the things I expected to hear, it wasn't that. The question confirmed my worst fear. He knew my routine. He had noticed when it changed, which meant he had been paying attention for a very long time. I didn't answer. I immediately walked toward a station employee near the customer service booth. The moment I did, the man turned around. No argument. No confrontation. No attempt to stop me. He simply walked away. By the time transit security arrived, he had disappeared into the parking lot. Police reviewed surveillance footage from multiple stations. They found images of him, but investigators couldn't identify him. No arrests were made. No explanation was ever given. And after that night, I never saw him again. Not once. The mystery should have ended there. But about 6 months later, I learned something that made the entire experience even stranger. A former coworker mentioned an older man who frequently rode late-night trains and was known among some transit employees. According to rumors, he spent years observing commuters and memorizing their routines. Nobody knew exactly why. Some believed he suffered from mental illness. Others thought he was simply obsessed with patterns and schedules. No one knew his name. No one knew where he lived. What haunts me isn't the possibility that he wanted to hurt me. It's that I may never know what he wanted at all. To this day, whenever I ride a nearly empty train late at night, I find myself looking toward the connecting doors, half expecting to see a man in a gray knit cap standing silently beneath the route map, watching, learning, and waiting for someone to break their routine. I never believed in ghost stories. Even after everything that happened, I still don't. What frightened me wasn't anything supernatural. It was the realization that a real person had been hiding just a few feet from my home for weeks, possibly months, while I had no idea they were there. In 2020, I rented a small townhouse on the northwest side of Chicago. It sat behind a row of older commercial buildings that housed a laundromat, a small grocery store, and a closed-down repair shop. The area wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't particularly busy at night either. Behind my townhouse was a narrow service alley used mostly by garbage trucks and delivery drivers. Most evenings, the alley was completely empty. That was one of the reasons I liked living there. It was quiet. At least it was until the knocking started. The first time happened on a Tuesday night. I woke suddenly and looked at my phone. Calm AM. At first, I wasn't even sure what had awakened me. Then I heard it. 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from my back door. I sat up in bed and listened. Nothing followed. No voices, no footsteps, no movement. Just silence. After several minutes, I convinced myself it was probably kids playing a prank. The next morning, I forgot about it. Then it happened again. Exactly 24 hours later. 3 slow knocks. The sound was identical. The spacing between each knock was the same. The force was the same. It was as though someone had rehearsed it. This time, I looked through the kitchen window that faced the alley. Nobody was there. The alley was empty. I checked twice before returning to bed. The third night, it happened again. 5 AM. 3 knocks. The fourth night too. Then the fifth. By the end of the week, I was exhausted. I started dreading nighttime. Every evening I found myself checking the clock repeatedly, waiting for 2 Maburay. And almost every night, right on schedule, the knocking came. Friends suggested I ignore it. My brother thought it was probably homeless people passing through the alley. A coworker joked that maybe I had a ghost with good time management. Nobody seemed particularly concerned. But I was. Because something felt wrong. The knocks were too consistent, too deliberate. Whoever was doing it wanted me to hear them. One Saturday, I bought a security camera and mounted it above the back door. The camera had motion detection and night vision. I was certain it would solve the mystery. At exactly 2 AM, the knocks returned. 3 slow knocks. I immediately checked the camera feed from my phone. Nothing. The alley appeared empty. The next morning I reviewed the recording. The sound was there, loud and clear. 3 distinct knocks, but no person appeared on camera. I watched the footage several times. Nothing moved. Nothing entered the frame. Nothing left it. The sound seemed to come from nowhere. For the first time, I felt genuinely scared. The following week, I bought a second camera. This one faced the alley from a different angle. Now there were no blind spots, or so I thought. That night, at exactly 2 a.m., the knocking happened again. Knock, knock, knock. The next morning, I reviewed both recordings. The result made my stomach drop. The sound was captured by both cameras, yet neither camera showed anyone, no person, no shadow, no movement. The alley appeared completely deserted. I showed the footage to a neighbor. He watched silently before shaking his head. "That's creepy," that was all he said. As the days passed, I became increasingly paranoid. I started locking every window twice. I left lights on throughout the house. I stopped sleeping well. Then something happened that pushed me over the edge. One morning, I found a small stone sitting directly outside my back door. There was nothing unusual about the stone itself, except that I was absolutely certain it hadn't been there the night before. The next morning, another object appeared, an old bottle cap. Then a few days later, a rusted key. Tiny items, meaningless items, placed carefully near the door, almost like someone was leaving markers or proof that they had been there. I finally called the police. An officer arrived one afternoon and listened patiently as I explained everything. I expected him to dismiss my concerns. Instead, he agreed that the situation was unusual. That evening, shortly before sunset, he returned with another officer. Together they examined the alley. At first they found nothing. Then one of them noticed something strange. Behind the abandoned repair shop was a narrow gap between 2 brick walls. The opening was barely visible unless you were looking directly at it. One officer squeezed through. A few seconds later, he called for his partner. I followed behind. What they found still gives me chills. Hidden in the narrow space was a makeshift living area. Old blankets, empty food containers, water bottles, a flashlight, a small camping chair. Someone had clearly been staying there, and judging by the amount of trash, they had been there for quite some time. Then one of the officers discovered something tucked beneath a blanket, a notebook. At first it looked like a random collection of notes. Then they started reading. Most pages contained observations, addresses, descriptions of houses, times people left for work, times they returned home, vehicle information, pet names, schedules, daily routines, page after page after page. Whoever wrote it had been watching people, not casually, systematically. Then one officer stopped turning pages. He looked up at me. My stomach sank. My address appeared several times, not just my address. Detailed notes. Leaves for work. 7:15. Returns around 6 Kao. Kitchen light off, 11 Mao. Usually alone. The entries stretched back months. Months. I had only noticed the knocking recently, but apparently someone had been observing me long before that. The police collected everything as evidence. They searched the area extensively. No suspect was found. No fingerprints led anywhere. No identification was recovered. The person who had been living there seemed to vanish overnight. And perhaps the strangest part? The knocking stopped immediately. Not once did I hear it again. Not the next night. Not the next week. Not ever. A few months later, I moved away. I told myself I was starting fresh. Yet even now, years later, certain sounds still trigger memories. If I hear a knock unexpectedly late at night, my heart immediately races. Sometimes I wake up around 2 a.m. and instinctively listen for it. 3 slow knocks. The sound that once echoed through the darkness behind my home. What unsettles me most isn't knowing that someone was watching. It's wondering why they finally decided to make contact. They had spent months silently observing me. Why start knocking? Why exactly 3 times? Why always at 2 a.m.? The person responsible was never identified, and the answers disappeared with them. But every now and then, when I think about that, hidden space behind the repair shop and the notebook filled with details about strangers' lives, I realize how close danger can sometimes be. Not out in some dark forest, not in an abandoned building, but hidden in the narrow spaces we walk past every day without ever noticing.